Welcome to the Anxious Love Coach podcast, a place for creating meaningful, conscious, secure, long-term partnerships. Here, we talk relationship anxiety and creating healthy, magnetic dynamics within partnership to help you feel confident and alive within committed partnership. My name is Natalie Kennedy, and I'm your host. I'm a relationship anxiety coach and meditation teacher. I've worked with hundreds of clients battling anxiety, and after experiencing extraordinary shifts in my own healing relative to partnership, now combine my lived personal experience and professional training to help others trust themselves within relationship and in their lives. I've been to the edge and back with my now husband from relationship anxiety and come out confidently to the other side. I want to pass the tools I've learned along to you to help you trust yourself in relationships and also create magnetic, hot dynamics with your partner. I believe lots of mainstream relationship advice today can make us anxious and dissatisfied. So let's jump in and normalize challenges that modern relationships and real people go through while also giving you tools to trust yourself, drop the shame, and alchemize your messy, twisted relational truths into profound inner wisdom and aliveness. If you haven't yet, be sure to join my communities over on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Anxious Love Coach. You can also request a 30-minute relationship anxiety assessment with me depending on availability, or ask me a question over on my website at www.anxiouslovecoach.com. I've also got a wonderful relationship anxiety meditation available to you as thanks for subscribing to my email list. Thanks for being here and enjoy this episode. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the Anxious Love Coach podcast. Today's episode is very exciting. I have a special guest who is a dear friend of mine and also a relationship anxiety coach like me. Although I think we have our own different energies and personalities, but we talk about very similar things. And our topic today is going to be how to for those of you listening, you'll probably already be skeptical just about this question because you've been listening to me for a while. But how do you know if you're in the right relationship? I think embedded in that question is a lot of Anyway, we're going to ask it because it's one of the top questions that both Sarah and I should introduce you before I say your name, but both of us talk on this question a lot. Anyway, today's guest is Sarah Yudkin. She is a relationship anxiety coach over at You Love and You Learn. Highly recommend following her over on Instagram. And she has a podcast now too that I was just a guest on earlier in the month. So that's very exciting. You can also find her over on TikTok. If I remember correctly, yes, you have an awesome TikTok account. So thanks for being on here today. I'm very excited to have you on and welcome back on the podcast. Were you on the podcast before?
I think we've done an Instagram live before, but I don't know.
That's what it was.
This is the first time on the podcast, but thank you for having me. It's exciting to chat.
It is exciting to chat. And yes, I think you're right. We did an Insta live.
Mm-hmm.
Well, welcome to the podcast. I know. So I'd love to, before we dive into the juice or the tea of this topic, for those of you who don't know Sarah, I'd love to give you an opportunity to hear her story so that you can find yourself in her story, because I think her story is very relatable. So Sarah, would you be willing to share your story, both as a relationship anxiety coach, but also a little bit of your personal story and your experience with relationship anxiety?
Yeah, definitely. So I am in the 7th year of being with Nate, my boyfriend, who is amazing. But there was a time when I was very panicky about our relationship. So I'll kind of rewind us back to earlier in our relationship, and Nate and I met through mutual friends. We hit it off right away and we shared a lot of common interests, one of those being like personal development and self-growth. And that's something that I've really always had an affinity towards. And in the beginning of our relationship, I did have that kind of honeymoon stage. And I know not everyone does, but I did. And we were long distance. And so every time we visited each other, it kind of felt like this exciting little mini vacation. And once things started getting more between us, like once we said, I love you, once we started meeting each other's families, there were these internal and external questions that started popping up. So internally, I just started checking in. How am I feeling about this? My parents had gotten a divorce in my young 20s, and this is my mid 20s. So it was pretty recent that happened. And so I was starting to ask questions like, okay, well, how do I know that I won't get a divorce one day? Or how do I know that this is the right relationship for me or the right person for me? But they were also met with external questions from friends. So, ooh, do you guys think that you'll move in together or close the gap, as people say with long distance relationships? Like, who's going to move to what city? Do you think that this is the right person for you? And so it was this mix of internal and external questioning of the relationship that started to add this pressure for it. And I would say that I'm, a high achiever, a perfectionist. I like to do the right thing. And I am an introspective person. And so that was probably part of my personality regardless. But I do think that this was the first time that it was a serious relationship where I could see myself actually being with him. And so there was that extra layer. So anxiety symptoms, I would wake up with a tightness in my chest, or I would have, I thought were gut feelings, or, my body would just be responding when I would hear things that people would say about a relationship. And I didn't know what was going on. It would feel very back and forth. And sometimes I would feel so excited about moving forward. And sometimes I would feel really scared and really uncertain. And so I'll fast forward a little bit to around the time of the pandemic. Nate and I moved in together for the first time, and I was put on furlough from my job. He had just gotten a back surgery. We were living at his mom's place. The world was in shambles. And so there were a lot of different factors that were kind of contributing to what I would call the peak experience of my relationship anxiety. And that was that one day I was just so in my head and just so scared and so upset by everything that was going on that when Nate and I were going on a walk together, I kind of broke down and said, I don't know if I love you the same way anymore. And at the time, that felt like the absolute scariest thing I could say or admit. And I was in tears, and it felt so big. And Nate, being the person that he is, he met me with like such kindness, such empathy. And he was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, he validated what I was feeling. We had just read this great book called The Molecule of More, that talks about dopamine and how we're constantly wanting that bigger, better offer of like, what's next. And so he was like, yeah, it sounds like it was probably just like the dopamine changing. Like, he was so steady and level-headed and so compassionate. And he was like, I hope that we don't end up breaking up, but if that's what you need, or if that's what you want, then I'll understand. And it was like this epiphany in that moment where I just realized, like, what the heck am I doing? Like, this is exactly the type of person I want to be with. I love him. I care about him. And that was kind of the moment that I realized I had to figure out what was going on. And that's kind of where You Love and You Learn began, as this mission to understand love and relationships and really just try to almost be, quote, better at relationships so that I would feel less anxious. And that was almost 3 years ago now. And now I help other people move through their own relationship anxiety or navigate it, because once I started sharing my story, similar to you, Natalie, a lot of people reached out and were like, how did you learn all this? Can you help me? And just wanted to at least get some level of support.
Wow. Sarah, I know I've been watching you talk about and listening to you talk about relationship anxiety for years, since I think a lot of people started blowing up and talking about relationship anxiety like maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So we all kind of found each other at the same time. And I think this is the first time I have like really heard the vulnerability of like the fullness of that story. Thank you for sharing. I had a similar experience with Preston, by the way, where I was like, I don't know if I love you anymore. And he's like, all right, well, let me know what you want to do. And I'll be okay no matter what. And I was like, what? You're supposed to like throw a tantrum and be like, oh no.
Yeah. And when people,
they don't do that.
Yeah. When people hear that part of my story, I know sometimes, first of all, not every partner responds that way. So I just want to normalize that. But I also think too, I always joke, like, if Nate had told me what I told him, like, we wouldn't be okay right now. So it just shows the different personalities of people and the ways that they operate, because I can fully acknowledge that wouldn't have been easy for me to hear at all. So I again, acknowledge that that's a hard thing to experience, but the way that Nate and it sounds like Preston were able to neutralize it a little bit, not take it so personally, and kind of see it as something separate from me, I guess, or you, it's really important.
Yes, I also think it's worth pointing out that obviously this is not a blanket statement for all men, but I do notice this pattern with a lot of men, which is that they have a lot of programming to be the rock. And so in that moment, it's almost like we polarize them into a sturdy place because we're all over the place. And so it's possible that they genuinely didn't take it personally, or it's possible that they totally did take it personally, but they didn't show it. And they created a perception of groundedness, which I don't know if necessarily that's right or wrong, or it's better or worse. You know, if Preston had freaked out, I might have grounded and been like, no, I'm okay. I'm actually fine. So,
That's true.
And there have been times where, for me at least, it happens in all long-term partnerships where it flips. So there have been times where Preston is in a whirlwind and I'm like, we're fine, you know?
Yep, absolutely. That can happen with Nate and I. Sometimes it can happen even more so with like work or like life stress, where one of us is really needing that steady ship. And Nate has told me many times that I was able to be that for him. And I'm like, I don't even see that, but thanks for reflecting it back to me.
I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people see us, because we are really good at holding it in. A lot of people think we're a lot more sturdy than we are. I can say that for sure. I think because I taught so much yoga for many years, I learned how to create this like meditation teacher persona that was not totally accurate. Anyway, that's another topic for another day.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So again, thank you for sharing your story, Sarah. It's so beautiful. So our topic today is about the quote unquote, I'm using my fingers here for those of you listening to the podcast, quote unquote, right relationship. How did you, or how did we arrive on this topic? What got you to be inspired about this?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking a lot lately, and I've been talking with some of my coaching clients about the difference between subjective opinions versus like facts or truth. And before we talked, I was looking up the definition of the word right. And one of the definitions is like truth or correctness or facts. And the other side of it is, I know we'll get to this later, is like this moral goodness or something that's acceptable or justified. But I think why I thought of this topic was because of the first thing I mentioned, like the truth, or if something's correct or a fact. And relationships are really a lot more about subjectivity or opinions or circumstances. And it involves a lot of internal understanding of who you are and what you're looking for at that time, and kind of what you're looking for in general in your life. Whereas I do think a lot of anxious minds, and I'll speak from my own experience, and I think many people are like this, and I don't even know if this is an anxious thing. This is a human thing. We like to have kind of a checklist or putting things in this box, and this is the right way to do it. And if I have the right way in front of me, then that means I'm good, or that means that I know that I'm on the right quote path. And then it gives us this sense of relieving responsibility. We don't feel as responsible maybe if something goes wrong because someone else told us it was right, or we thought we were doing the quote right thing. So then we don't have to maybe turn inward, I'll say, and look for where we contributed to a pattern or responsibility. So that's kind of what was inspiring me when you asked about, like, is there anything on your mind or heart lately? That's kind of what came up as something that is not so easy to sift through, but I thought it would be fun to sift through together.
It is a very fun thing to sift through together. And I love how, and I almost want to revisit it. And I'm not sure I can articulate it quite as well as you just did. So I might ask you to say this again, either in the same way, so we can just digest it, or in a slightly different way, about how rightness is, the quest for rightness is has something to do with responsibility, but I can't articulate it like you just did. Would you say that again? Because it makes sense in my head, but I can't put it in words at the moment.
Yeah, I hope I can say it the same. And sometimes things just flow out. But what I'm trying to say is that when someone else tells us what's right, or if we think that we're looking to maybe society's definition of what's right, or if we think that there is this one right way, then it kind of takes away us needing to take responsibility for actually determining what is quote, quote, right for us in that given or circumstance. And so I think that's why it's really tempting to label things as either right or wrong, or hope that there is a label of right or wrong, because then we can kind of just say, oh, well, I'm following that rule, or someone told me here's like the 10 things that make up a right relationship. And so as long as I check all these boxes, then I'm good to go. But it removes this need to reflect on your own unique desires or experiences or circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I think that's a really key point to understand. And I noticed this as well. Raise your hand. I'm just speaking to a broad audience here. Raise your hand if you have called someone when you are having relationship anxiety and have tried to get the answer from the other person. I had a wise aunt that I would call all the time. Raise your hand if you had that one person that you'd call for reassurance. Okay. Sarah is raising her hand. And it's true. It was my way of absolving responsibility for my life, because I trusted her. So I still do, but I trusted her more than I trusted myself. Mm-hmm. And I also would outsource my trust to society. And in that way, if I have someone else to blame if things go wrong. So if I do what my aunt says and it goes wrong, then I can blame her for it. I don't have to blame myself. But when I make a decision on my own behalf and it goes quote unquote wrong, whatever the hell that means, then I have no one to blame but myself. And the irony is I've noticed this, when you take out the rightness and wrongness, you also take out the blame. You arrive at like this isness. This is what's so.
I love that. And I think I was doing that. I have a few friends that I would talk to. I can think of one right around the time where I was having this moment of peak relationship anxiety. I have one friend who I would call a lot, and she would always validate that Nate and I were so perfect for each other. And I know that it must be really hard to think this way, but just, you guys are so great and all these things. And it would feel good for like 2 hours. Maybe if I was lucky, 2 days, and then it was right back to questioning. And so I think that we're not, of course, thinking consciously, oh, then I get to blame my friend or my aunt, but subconsciously, that's almost like the protective mechanism of outsourcing that decision.
Yeah, it's not like a malicious plan to blame them, but it's a form of self-protection. It's an avoidance of ownership of your life and your experience.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, what is rightness? What is rightness? If we're going to ask what's the right relationship, let's just look at the word right.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where my mind goes in different directions between what is looked at as right societally, or in these definitions I just gave as being either correct or good or acceptable. That's kind of one way of looking at it. But where I've tended to go a little bit more lately is that more subjective lane, which is more personalized, and it's more opinion based of what is right for me uniquely, and what is not only right for me uniquely, but what is right for me uniquely in this moment. Because I think sometimes we are so busy looking at how could life look in 5 years or 10 years, but we haven't even really done enough digging of like what we even are looking for in this moment. So it's kind of the brain will go so far into the future versus actually rolling up our sleeves and deciding, hey, what is feeling good for me right now? Or if not, what can I decide to do about it? So I'll look at examples for me personally. I think, so Nate and I moved to Sweden a few years ago, which is great. And in the moment where he said we could maybe move to Sweden, I had lived abroad before. And so I was like, oh, that sounds so great. That sounds right. That sounds fun. But there could have been someone who had never lived abroad, really doesn't like traveling or doing anything like that. And their partner could have said, hey, I got this job opportunity in Sweden. What do you think? And that might not have felt right to them at all. And so this is where it gets really unique to the person that you're talking to, because what was right for me was to move to Sweden. But if I wrote a social media post saying, the right relationship is one where you move to another country together, or where you're willing to move to somewhere, or
you
where
won't have to, the opposite.
Exactly. Yeah. Or you shouldn't have to move. It's like, this is one small example, but I think that's where we tend to underestimate the effect of like someone else giving you insight. It's because that worked for me, but it might not work for somebody else. So going to a more general example, I think there's things that we see on social media or we get advice about, like, oh, well, the right relationship is one where you feel like your best self, or the right relationship is one where you're supported unconditionally, or whatever it is. And even then, I just think there's so much nuance there, because what does it mean to feel your best self? What does it mean to feel supported? What does it mean, if someone is treating you well? It's like there's so much subjectivity to this that is unique, and the person, the eye of the beholder, whatever that expression is all going to be different. And so even when you see this list of what it means to be in a quote, quote, right relationship, you still have to make up your own unique definitions of everything on that list. Does that feel true for you?
Yes. Yeah. I think of it, so even though I'm not a certified relationship coach, I am a certified health coach. And I just kind of noticed that my coaching, and by the way, we were taught on how to coach around relationships as one piece of nutrition school, because relationships feed you. They just don't feed you in your mouth, but they feed you in your soul. And we had a very holistic approach. And just so I noticed that my coaching eventually went all the way into relationships. And by then I'd had a lot of life experience to speak on it a lot. But one of the things we were taught about is this thing called bioindividuality. And what that means is what's one person's medicine is another person's poison. And so what works for one person might not work for another. And it also applies to yourself. What works for you now might not work for you in 10 years. And what works for you now might not have worked for you, or what works for you now would not have worked for you 10 years ago. And so it's constantly changing. And I think the brunt of the relationship anxiety experience is kind of being on the fence. And there's this lovely women's relationship coach that I follow named Laura Doyle. And she says, get off the fence. It's hurting your butt. You get splinters in your butt. Get off. And I think in those moments, it can be helpful to have the discipline to ask yourself, am I leaving today? If not, go all in today. And that could be an example of black and white thinking, but I actually think it's really helpful, because if you're thinking about the future and you're making your decisions on whether to open your heart to this person now based on what could happen 5 years in the future, well, it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy if you close your heart today. If you want to give your relationship the maximum chance of success, being half in, half out is probably the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. Absolutely. I always talk about the word deciding to be there, because I think that, with this whole conversation of, is this the right relationship? I think if I had a time machine and I could fast forward to when I was 80, then if I see me and Nate are still together, like, one could argue that I made the quote right choice. If we're not together, someone could argue I made the wrong choice, but maybe it was what needed to happen. But I think that if we're judging a relationship, if it's right or wrong versus, or like based on the longevity, relationship, like that's not necessarily fair. And so a better question is, can I decide today that this is a relationship that I want to be in, despite not having guaranteed outcomes? And that's kind of how I had to change the conversation for me, judging a relationship as being right as if it was successful in the long term. But I don't get to see if it's successful in the long term. I can only see if it's successful, quote, quote, today. It's like, I feel like there's so many words that we can use air quotes for because it's all like, what does successful even mean? But as long as in this moment today, I'm feeling like I want to move forward in my relationship, can that be enough? And even if every single day for the next 50 years, I woke up and made a choice to be in the relationship, who's to say that my relationship still won't be super nourishing? You know what I mean? So hopefully every single day I'm not waking up and asking myself this question, and I no longer do at the moment. But who's to say that I couldn't still make that choice and still have a beautiful life with Nate along the way?
Yeah, I think, and even the word love is one of those words that can go in air quotes, because sometimes the decision to love is a difficult one, especially as the stakes get higher and higher and higher. I mean, Press and I are planning on having kids. And so as the stakes get higher, there's more to lose. And my inner little, maybe it's my wounded inner child, maybe it's my inner narcissist that feels entitled to all the things all the time. I'm not even using the word narcissist in a negative way. I'm just saying the part of me that thinks life revolves around me believes that I shouldn't have to go through a divorce. I shouldn't have to go through loss. I shouldn't have to go through disappointment. And it's actually, in my opinion, a little bit entitled to think that like that shouldn't happen to me. If things go right, then I'm above that. And it's been actually very humbling to accept that, yes, absolutely, I could spend 20 years with someone and then it disintegrates. And that didn't necessarily mean I made the wrong choice, but there isn't some path I can take that guarantees that won't happen to me. And that's very, very humbling, because it means that you're actually consciously choosing something with red flags. And there's red flags. There are red flags in my relationship. There are even some red flags that I don't share publicly. And I'm just like, there are people that would leave my relationship if they saw the extent of this. And I still want to be here. And that's really messy. And a lot of people don't want to hear that. They don't want to accept that. But the more I talk to people, sometimes via podcast, but sometimes behind the scenes, the more I talk to people, I'm like, oh, we're all going through the same thing. Oh, you're going through that too. Like it's very humbling to recognize that a lot of us are choosing to be with people who maybe have, and I want to, this is where I feel a little squeamish going into, because I know that we always have this disclaimer. I see you put this disclaimer on all your TikToks, and I put this similar disclaimer on all my contents. Like, this does not apply to abusive relationships. But then even the word abuse can sometimes be subjective, because if my Preston, gets mad at me and raises his voice at me, are we calling that abuse? And so I don't want to go too deep into that, because I don't even think I'm credentialed enough to speak on things like abuse. But there are a lot of things that people might consider to be red flags that I have chosen to stay through, because that is what is right for me. And this is the commitment I have chosen. I feel really vulnerable saying this. I'm surprised it came out of my mouth. But do you relate to this? Am I alone here?
No, you're definitely not alone. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it gets into this conversation of like morality, because not only can we judge, like, is our relationship good enough for other people's eyes, but also like, is my partner, is the stuff they're doing like good enough for me? And I've heard you talk before about like one of the ways that we lose attraction for our partners if like we think we're above them. But I think that's sometimes where we get into some of this like red flag gray area, is like, what is a red flag, or like what is something that Nate does that is unacceptable or not? Like, I have to decide if that's real for me or not, or what my truth is there. And there are things that throughout our relationship have been consistent challenges. And like you said, someone else may be like, I couldn't do that, or I don't want to do that. But for me, it's never been a reason to actually leave the relationship. And so even if the same thing has come up that has come up for 6 years, I'm like, if I was going to leave this relationship because of this thing, like I probably would have done it by now. Or if it ever happens where it does make me feel like, okay, this crossed a line, like I'll only know that at the time. And so I think that would be something I also share with anyone listening. Like if you keep saying, well, what if, like you have to trust your future self that if something became a hard and fast no, that you would know it at the time. But until then, trying to reflect or what if yourself into potential scenarios is not really helping.
Yeah, it's like putting yourself up on that fence and getting splinters in your butt. It feels very safe up on that fence. But in the meantime, you're getting splinters in your butt and sacrificing any intimacy you could be having.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that analogy. Get off the fence.
It's a good splinters in your butt. It's a good one. I like Laura Doyle.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So I guess for those people who are listening and they're like, yeah, that sounds really fine and dandy to have self-trust. And like, I wish I could say that I will trust myself to make that decision, make that call. How do you make that? How might you make that discernment? And I'm not saying that the answer exists, but I'm going to just put the question out there.
Yeah. For me, it really has helped to have like a framework to think about incompatibility. And we talked about on my podcast, which I loved, you said something that I hadn't really thought about before, but I loved the way you phrased it, which was that there can be moments of incompatibility where there isn't necessarily a perfect solution and you kind of have to compromise. So just for context, in the podcast, you were sharing an example of like, if you and Preston were both feeling, you just got over colds or something and you were sick and tired and like wanted company, but he was like working or something. And at that moment, there wasn't a direct solution, but that might've been a moment of incompatibility, but that doesn't mean your whole relationship is incompatible. So I love that distinction, but I kind of talk about incompatibilities on the more macro level of like the relationship as a whole. And in my webinar where I talk about incompatibility, I kind of have this framework of, does this relationship have anything that goes against your major life values? Does it go against the vision you have for your life? Even though you can't guarantee what that vision will turn into, but just thinking about it, asking the question, and does this person cross any major boundaries of yours? So if you reflect on those 3 topics, even if there's differences, can you accept or respect the differences? So that's like one part of the equation. The other part that I talk about is that personality differences, flaws, or things that irritate you about your partner are not necessarily incompatibilities unless they fall into the other category of values, vision, and boundaries. So that's just one framework. It's not, again, the right answer, but for me, that's helped me as I'm thinking about my own relationship, because if something is really straying from your values or your life vision, then that's just at least a sign to get curious and ask yourself, okay, well, what's going on here? And am I open to talking about this with my partner? Like, are they willing to hear me out here? And it doesn't mean that it's a perfect framework. It doesn't mean that every single question will be answered, but it just gives you some things to start reflecting on in your own situation. And then from there, knowing that you don't have to make any decision right away, like you said. But if you ask yourself the question, am I actually leaving today? And the answer is no, well then, okay, how can I try to take small steps to improve the relationship or improve my relationship to the relationship internally?
Yeah, I love that. It's like, if you're here, you might as well pour your heart out into it. And because if they're the one, maybe they're not the one 30 years from now, but they're the one right now. And if there is another one 30 years from now, you'll be glad you practiced with this one. Yeah, I do like the topic of incompatibility on a macro and a micro level. Can I share another example from our honeymoon that I think people might find useful? So in the past, I definitely was one of those people that associated personality differences as incompatibilities. And I think if you are one of those people who's getting caught in that. I think it's a trap. The trap of thinking that personality differences are an incompatibility. It's worth looking at the greater context of the relationship and the circumstances that you're currently going through. So for instance, Preston and I just recorded a podcast on this that I haven't released yet, all about our honeymoon and like how it was beautifully messy. But we have I have a luxury of an online business, so I can be online and I don't have to be in a certain location. And we'd always wanted to go to Australia. So we were like, let's go for a month because a month is better than 2 weeks. Not true. 2 weeks would have been even better. I wish we had done shorter because we got so damn lonely. A month is a long time to go to a foreign country with no routine and no friends and no grounding things. And so I found myself like longing for my girlfriends, like hanging out with my girls. And he was longing for his guy friends, hanging out with his guys and talking about man things that I have no interest in talking about and jokes that I don't find funny, arguably offensive ones. I'm like, wow, Preston, you would get canceled so hard if my audience knew you said that. Does Nate ever do stuff like that?
Yes. Last night he sent a meme about King Kong climbing a building, and then the view from inside the building was like King Kong's private parts. So I'm like, this is not, I'm laughing now because it is kind of funny, but I was like, he was cracking up about it. And I'm like, boys will be boys. And of course his friends responded in the group chat like, oh my God. And I was just like,
I know some of the things that I will see Preston looking at his phone and he will just be like wheezing in laughter. And I'll look over and it'll be like some dumb thing. And I'm like, and so when we were on honeymoon, Preston wasn't really getting that from his guy friends so much. They had like their little group chat and stuff. But what started to happen is he would start bringing that side of himself that is usually reserved for his guy friends. It starts coming out to me. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, I can't meet you there, my love. And vice versa. I would start going to him about things that I usually talk about with my girlfriends. And like my girlfriends know exactly how to respond. They're like, oh my God, I totally get it. I have that too. You're not alone. Whereas Preston will be like, oh, well, you should just do this. And I'm like, I
don't want a solution.
I don't want a solution. Or the vice versa, he would come to me with just something he wants to vent about, and I'd give him a solution, and he doesn't want a solution. The point is, if you only looked at the tiny little interaction between us, you'd think, wow, this couple doesn't love each other. When we were checking into our first hotel, we were bickering because we hadn't slept for like 12 hours on the flight to Australia. And we were checking in and I wanted to ask for a honeymoon upgrade. I was like, we're on our honeymoon. I felt a little self-conscious because I was like, oh my God, they're going to think that we hate each other. We're on our honeymoon and we're like bickering. And I was worried that the hotel like receptionist was going to be like, oh wow, their marriage is doomed. Like they're on honeymoon and they're bickering. And so I felt pressure to play up our romance and make it look like we were super in love. And it's like, dude, we've been together for 11 years. Anyway, long story short, if you had only looked at the little container, the little pocket of our relationship of this month of March where we were on honeymoon, you would see two people who were really homesick and trying to get their needs met from the other person. And that other person had never really had the burden of meeting that need. And all of a sudden we did. And it was actually really, really difficult. And so there were a lot of incompatibilities in that interaction over the month. But as a whole, when we are part of a larger context where I have friends and he has friends and I have hobbies and he has hobbies, when we have a large support network with a lot of support, a large context where we are individually supported, the relationship thrives and it's very compatible. So I want to highlight that too.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. And there's micro incompatibilities between Nate and I all the time. And macro level, I think we're great together and our personality differences fit so nicely. It's almost like that yin and yang that people talk about. Like there are so many ways where we really do kind of connect in those differences. But moment to moment, there's so much of that. And thank you for sharing, because I think that going back to the question of this podcast of like, what is right or wrong? If I asked someone right now, journal, what is your honeymoon going to be like? It's like the stuff that you just shared, like they wouldn't make space for any of that, I don't think. If you write down this fantasy kind of ideal of exactly how everything's supposed to look and feel. But I love that you're able to make room for that. And also there were so many things I'm sure that were right about your honeymoon. So it's just
Totally. Yeah.
Those things coexist. But so often we make it either fully right or fully wrong and don't think about the messy middle.
Yeah. I remember I went on Reddit, which is not my, I did the thing that I tell you guys not to do, which is I went on Reddit and I said, searched, is it normal to be fighting on your honeymoon? And I swear to God, I saw everything, Sarah. I saw people being like, if you had a bad honeymoon, you're going to have a bad marriage. And I was like, oh no. And then other people were like, it's totally normal. Other people were like, I had the worst honeymoon of my life and I had a great marriage, been married for 30 years. So all the combinations of life experience, all the life experience combinations exist.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the circumstance thing that we've kind of brought up a little bit, or the opinions, because two different opinions can both be true. Like I had the worst honeymoon ever, and then I ended up getting a divorce. It's like, and then
right, that does happen.
Yeah, that's probably very true in many circumstances. And then in someone else, it's like, oh, worst honeymoon ever, but we had the best marriage. It's like, I don't want to say it's a fluke. Obviously, like there are different things and reasons for why that was the way it was for those people. But that's another reason why getting advice of what's right and wrong is not very helpful, because only you know your own life and circumstances. And what is, like we said, right for that person may just not be for you. And so you have to have that little bit of discernment. Like, is this for me or is this not?
I'm glad you used the word discernment. There was, and maybe you covered this already, but I remember before we got on this call, you wanted to talk about the difference between judgment and discernment. I guess we already kind of talked about that. Are you content with that?
Yeah,
I answered it before. Okay.
I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah. So we covered the judgment versus discernment. It's like, is it objectively right or wrong, or is it just right or wrong for me? With that, how does one make a decision that feels in alignment? What is alignment?
Yeah. So very quickly rewinding to that word discernment, just the only thing I'll add about it is kind of discernment is asking the question, does this feel in alignment for me? Whereas judgment would be like, oh, that's bad. That's good. And so discernment is a little bit more personalized, of based on everything I know to be true about myself today, and based on what I know to be true about this other person today, like, can I decide if this feels like it could be a fit? I'll use the word fit. Like, that's what I think alignment means to me. Like, does this feel like a fit for me in this moment? And I think that so often it's hard to actually answer that question because we're trying to project it out as a fit forever. But I kind of already explained a little bit about that question of like, today in this moment, can I decide that this feels like it could work for me and for us and for the relationship, not just thinking about you, but thinking about the collective. And it does take knowing yourself. It takes knowing like, hey, based on what I want out of my life, or at least what I think I do, like, how does this fit? And do I think that I'm in a relationship with someone that's willing to have difficult conversations? Or the amount of effort that I put in, like, do I see them putting in any effort in response? Like, it's just these questions that you'll have to really check in with yourself. And knowing that if it's not perfect today, that doesn't mean, first of all, perfect is a myth, but even if it's not how you exactly imagined, that doesn't mean that it's bad or not right. And so it's such a hard thing to even say to somebody of this is exactly how you make that decision. But for me, every time my anxiety would tell me, this isn't going to work, there was something that said, all right, well, let's still try. And I can't be in everybody's head to see if they have that same voice. Sometimes it would be fun to be in other people's heads, though, to see what they're thinking.
It would
But
be, but then we'd be cult leaders.
yeah,
Although maybe that would be fun. That's
yeah.
a joke.
I do feel the talk though about like maybe being able to read people's minds in the future. I'm like, that kind of makes me a little nervous, like of actually knowing exactly what everyone thinks. Yeah, I like that privacy. But I do think that at the end of the day, there's something that has decided to keep you in this situation right now. And I can't answer what that something is. But going back to the original question of what's in alignment, it's just kind of deciding, like, is this something that's keeping me here in this moment? Like, can I grow that? Or is the thing that's keeping me here really, something that is just me being really kind of afraid that there's nothing else or something like that? Like, even that question feels a little scary. But for me, it was never like I'm staying just because like I'm so scared to leave and not find somebody. It was like, no, I'm scared to not be in this relationship. I really love this relationship with Nate. So that last part, I kind of went on a little tangent that could, that could bring up questions, but yeah.
The anxious mind will always find more and more questions. And there actually came a point in my healing journey where I realized how empowering it was to stop asking questions.
Yeah.
Which creates a real silence in your mind, and it is kind of uncomfortable because we wonder, like, who am I if I'm not seeking the answers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
And so if there is this constant questioning, then there's always this constant seeking of the right answer. I would love to like run a study to see if like us anxious people are like really good at math or something, because it's just very good. It's nice to always know that a right answer exists, but life doesn't work like that. Sometimes there are answers that are very clear cut, and sometimes they're just not that obvious. And for me, I think you're right, Sarah. A lot of times what's in alignment is more of a preference in the moment. And a preference might be a preference that is for right now. And it could also be a preference based on a vision I have for the future. And sometimes it's weighing those out, the decision I'm making for short-term gratification versus a decision I'm making for the long-term future. So for instance, let's say, and this happened to me when I was experiencing relationship anxiety really bad. Our sex life was terrible. It was just awful. There was no desire. There was a lot of resentment. And by a lot of standards, this is where people leave the relationship and don't regret it. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But for me, I was like, I have this weird faith that we're going to get through this. And I want to build a life with this person. And so based on that, even though my preference there might be a part of me that wants to run right now and leave the relationship and just fuck it, throw in the towel. There's another part of me that wants to take a chance on love and not get on the fence, but not leave either, which means if I'm not leaving, but I'm not on the fence, where does that leave me? It leaves me in commitment to this partnership. Yeah. So I'm giving it everything I got. I went like even harder into the relationship. And what I start to notice is like when I humbly open my heart in partnership, my partner often responds that way too. And, it did get better, like way better. And I look back and I'm like, man, thanks past me. Thanks past me for making that kind of delayed gratification and trusting this partnership. Now I'm not to say that there's always a timeline for women. I think we want kids. And so for me, I was like, do I really want to throw it away now? I want kids I want kids soon. Maybe I could find someone 0.05% better. I doubt it. I mean, I'm looking back on the 11 years, I'm like, this is really freaking good. I got really, really lucky. So I'm just very grateful that past me decided to have faith
Yeah, I love that. And it was so fun meeting both you and Preston when we had
Yes. I want to meet
couple.
Nate sometime. I'd really like that.
Yeah, definitely. But one question came up that I just thought of too, that the answer might not be fully clear to somebody. So I don't want them to feel like they need to know it. But the question of like, when you are asking people for advice or when you're looking for the right thing to do, is it because you're looking for permission to stay? Or are you looking for someone to give you permission to go? Because that can be a really powerful question. Because whenever I would talk to my friends, I was always like, please tell me that my relationship is like perfect and amazing. And I have a feeling that that might be some kind of experience that you were going to your aunt. Like, it's like you kind of wanted her to tell you like it was all going to be okay. Whereas like if someone ever gave me advice, like, well, I don't know, this doesn't seem like a fit. I was like, no, like it is. Like I would then defend my position. And so
Isn't that ironic?
just like it's like there's no right answer to this question. It's all personal preference. But like if you're trying to get permission to go, like, okay, like can you at least make peace with that? And if you're trying to get permission to stay, then at least just use that as a sign that for whatever reason, there's something that's in alignment right now, and you can dig deeper into that.
Yeah. Even though you're having all these questioning thoughts, some part of you is still here for whatever reason, and it's not a dumb one.
Yeah.
So it is worth putting some faith and be curious about the part of yourself that's like actually rooted, even though your mind and your emotions are wild. The reality is you have not said, I'm done and packed your bags. Why is that? There's something here. And I realize there are contexts where this might not be useful, but that's always true. So I trust that those of you guys who are listening have the self-trust and discernment to decide what parts of this podcast are useful for you and which parts are not.
Yes, well said.
Well, is there anything else you would like to share or add?
I don't think so. I feel like this conversation came to like a good full circle moment. So I think I feel complete.
I feel complete too. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on here today. Where can we find you?
So You Love and You Learn pretty much everywhere, Instagram, TikTok, and my website is youloveandyoulearn.com. So if anyone wants more information, that's where you can find me. And also, as you mentioned earlier, I just started my podcast. So the You Love and You Learn podcast is now live as well. So people can check that out.
I listened to the episode that I was in, and I just want to let you know it sounds amazing.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for sounding amazing on my podcast. It's a compliment to both of us.
Yes, it was my little proud moment, but also it's a very professional sounding. So I wanted to, that was the main point I wanted to make. It sounds really, really good.
Good. Well, thank
Yeah.
you.
You guys, You Love and You Learn is where it's at. Make sure you go follow Sarah on Instagram and TikTok. She's a wizard. By the way, you're freaking whoever your media designer is, and I think you sent him to me earlier, is amazing. I'm always so envious of your designs.
Oh,
so
thanks.
everybody go follow Sarah. Everybody go
Thank
follow
you.
Sarah. Yeah. Thank you so much for being on here today. It was such a pleasure having you on.
Yeah, it was so much fun. Thank you.
Yes. All right. Thanks everybody for listening, and hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll catch you in the next one. Thanks so much for listening to The Anxious Love Coach today. If you loved this episode, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and maybe share it with someone that you believe might benefit from these perspectives. Please also subscribe to my email list at www.anxiouslovecoach.com, as I'm trying to reduce my reliance on social media. In exchange, you will receive my free relationship anxiety meditation and more supportive tools sent your way. If you would like to work with me, head on over to my website at, again, anxiouslovecoach.com to explore different tiers of coaching options and online programs. Thanks again for listening, and catch you in the next episode. Have a blessed day.